are interested in bringing those forward. But for tonight's discussion, we are going to focus on long-term rental occupancy. So that's 30 days or more. And so what's important to talk about is the regulatory framework that the city must abide by with any regulations it makes. So the city it must be consistent with our federal fair housing law. And those laws have changed since our code was adopted in 1969. And so any new laws that we create will have to be consistent with federal fair housing law. And we cannot create laws that discriminate, and we cannot create laws that define family. And this is probably a slide that we'll end up coming back to as we kind of get into some of the nitty-gritty of what we're gonna propose to you all. So our current zoning definitions, so in our zoning code today, if you look up a couple of terms, I wanted to define them for you all and what you would find in our code. So if you look up boarding house or rooming house, that means a dwelling other than a hotel where lodging or lodging and meals for 2 or more persons is provided for compensation. And a housekeeping unit means an individual or a group of persons that occupy a dwelling unit that has a single kitchen. So we're proposing to replace the definition of boarding house. It's become an ineffective term, and really if we go back to that definition, the definition states that really renting to 2 or more persons is defined as a boarding house. So many people, when they think of what a boarding house is, obviously assume a lot more people than 2 individuals. And what's a challenge for the city is that when we enforce rules and regulations, we have to enforce them consistently. And so that definition of 2 or more persons, 2 individuals being a boarding house, is kind of a challenging issue in terms of providing for consistent enforcement. And so today, we may consider an individual living in a single family district, 2 individuals living in a single family district in a residence being consistent with that zoning district, but 10 individuals may not be consistent. So there's some conflicts with that existing term. So we are also proposing to revise the definition of single housekeeping unit to mean a individual or group of persons occupying a dwelling unit used as a common living arrangement. Evidence of a common living arrangement may include some or all of the following: shared living expenses, such as rent or mortgage payments, food and utility costs, a single lease, or shared chores. And the primary housekeeping unit can be renters, they can be owners of the unit. So some potential approaches include replacing the term boarding house with some more precise regulations to address this issue of overcrowding. So it's to establish a maximum number of individuals who can occupy a residence in addition to the single housekeeping unit. I'm going to also refer to that as a single household. People have an easier time thinking of a household. And the single housekeeping unit / single household would not be included in the number of individuals regulated. And the number of individuals regulated, so this is just another way of looking at it, would be the number of individuals in addition to the single housekeeping unit or single household. And really that term single housekeeping unit, single household, I'll get into, is something protected by fair housing law. And so that's something that we are not proposing to regulate, but proposing to regulate outside of that definition. And we're also proposing standards that would require common habitable area in single-family residences and duplexes. Ooh, pushed the wrong button. There. So regarding occupancy in a residence, so what we're proposing is to limit the number of individuals based on the type of housing type, and this is the number of individuals in addition to a single housekeeping unit. So for a single family dwelling, that would be 3 individuals. For a duplex, that would be 2 individuals per unit. For a multiple dwelling unit, that would be 2 individuals per unit. What describes this is the example of the single family dwelling, but that can be applied to both the duplex and the multi-dwelling unit, is the single household, right? And if we go back to the definition of what that is, that's individuals who share a common living arrangement. They have chores, they share living expenses. those individuals would be in the single household / single housekeeping unit. And those are not those individuals are not what we're proposing to throw a number at. What we're proposing to do is throw a number at and regulate the number of individuals outside that single household. So that would be 3 for a single family dwelling. It would be 3 additional individuals. So common habitable area, as I mentioned before, a practice that we're seeing is individuals removing a living room, a dining room, converting those into additional bedrooms in order to maximize the number of individuals who live in them. So this particular regulation is intended to prevent that practice. And it would be proposing a minimum percentage of habitable floor area available for all common use. So that would be combining all those areas, such as dining rooms, living rooms, kitchens, garages, and hallways are not proposed to be considered common use areas. So the minimum commonable habitable area that we've created a range for, and we haven't decided exactly which percentage we've landed on yet, but would be between 25 to 30% of the total habitable area for a single family residence. So if we want to do kind of a calculation here, assume a 1,000 square foot house. In that 1,000 square foot house, we would add up the dining room, the living room, the kitchen, and that amount of area would have to equal at least, if we went with 25%, 250 square feet. So that could be one large kitchen, that could be a kitchen, dining room, living room, but we wouldn't be adding things like hallways or garages into that calculation of the percentage. And the percentage of habitable floor area for common use in duplexes has not yet been determined. And why we're proposing 25 to 30% is we're not trying to create a high number. We recognize that a lot of properties are built. We've done a very thorough analysis of building permits that have been issued, and we feel that 25 to 30% actually is a very good low number that the vast majority of properties can meet. So through analysis of our building permit records, that's how we've landed on proposing either 25 to 30% and this is for single family residences. We haven't done that analysis for duplexes yet, and so we intend to do that and provide a percentage that we think would be appropriate. So, once again, we're several steps away from the City Council adopting any sort of regulations or even considering regulations, but should regulations be adopted, the ones that we're proposing today, we want to talk a little bit about how would we handle those regulations when we have an existing, obviously building supply. So any legal non-conforming buildings, so legal non-conforming means that you're not conforming now because we've created new laws and you don't conform to them, but you're legal because you went through whatever permit process was required at the time. So when you added that extra bedroom to your house, you actually got building permits for that. So anybody who's legal non-conforming and doesn't meet the minimum common habitable area percentage, and once again, we think that that's going to be a very low number of people because of our analysis, we'd propose would have a period of time, perhaps 2 years, to get into compliance. They could do things like remove walls to create that common space. They could obtain whatever permits, of course, that would be necessary to do that, but we would give them a period of time to get into compliance. And then after that sunset period, really, if those uses didn't have the adequate amount of common habitable area that we're calling out, the city would be interested in calling that a commercial activity and would want to regulate that activity through a commercial use permit. So a commercial use permit would allow the city to regulate, parking standards, the use itself in terms of, maybe the number of individuals or activities that could occur. So the use permit allows the city to have a discretionary permit that could be pulled on the property, but it would allow the city to look at it from a commercial activity, not a residential activity. So enforcement of new standards for the occupancy issue. So if the city were to adopt some of the occupancy numbers that we had described, really, the way that we anticipate hearing about those issues after a compliance period of about 2 years would be through our code enforcement process. So individuals would call us, say, hey, on my street, there are a lot of people living here, and we would go through the code enforcement steps. And really, we're intending, we don't intend to flip a switch after council makes a decision on any regulation and say, from the next day forward, everyone needs to comply. We'd want to give a sunset period so that people have time to make changes and to provide adequate notice to tenants. And we would hope that individuals wouldn't literally wait till the last moment for whatever that period of time is, if it was 2 years or whatnot, and would stop that non-conforming practice and minimize disruption as individuals move out. So we've had some community meetings on April 29th and May 16th, provided the same information as you're hearing tonight. We are also going to be sending out online surveys in the next week or so. So if you signed in, we have your email address. Please check that email address because we will send you a link to that survey, and it will include topics not just on this, but on our entire zoning code update that we really want to get some more feedback on things such as short-term rentals, which I described earlier. And we would like to work with anyone as this progresses, so this isn't your only opportunity to kind of ask questions or stay connected to this. We will also be providing the City Council a study session with our Planning Commission in the fall, and we would bring the update forward to the Planning Commission and City Council in the winter timeframe at the end of this year, beginning of next year. And so with that, that's my contact information, and we are going to keep our website updated with all the meeting minutes as well as frequently asked questions, and any comments we've received, we'll also update that to our website. So with that, really interested in getting people on the same page with answering any questions. And Rebecca Bustos will be coming around. Just to remind everyone, since this is live streamed, we need people to speak into the mic, otherwise nobody else outside of this room will be able to hear your question.
Hi. You guys talk about overcrowding, yet the city plans on building over 2,000 apartment units in the next few years that won't share the same regulations as single-family homes. So the way that it's described, it sounds like in the back, I think, yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. The way that you guys are going to restructure the way it sounds, you're trying to change it so that it fits what you guys are developing, and it's sort of hard to point out what I wanted to say, but essentially, the fair housing laws that are created, it sounds like you guys are sort of doing something that you can get around that to get what you want. You know what I'm saying? With this limitation that you guys are creating. So I think if you apply this to all homes that are being built in Santa Clara, not just single-family homes, but also to the new apartment complexes, then I think that might be fair.
Yeah, thank you.
I might have another thing to talk about in a second.
Yes, okay.
Actually, I'll let Rena answer the question, but I also want to introduce myself. I'm Andrew Crabtree, also with the Planning Division here, and I'm going to help tag team on some of these questions.
Yeah, so just wanted to provide this slide for some context because the occupancy numbers that we're proposing are for single-family, duplex, and multi-dwelling units. The common open space, or the common area, habitable area, we're limiting to duplex and single-family homes. Honestly, most of the concerns we've heard through code enforcement has been with single-family homes and duplexes, primarily single-family homes, but we are proposing some occupancy standards for multi-dwelling units as well. Regarding fair housing, I actually think that what we're trying to do explicitly is not violate any fair housing laws, because the single housekeeping unit is really what is paramount to the tenets of fair housing law, and that group of individuals, and if we look at the definition of single housekeeping unit, that does not talk about any blood relationship. It's really about a shared living arrangement, and that people agree upon and can demonstrate through rent or mortgage payments, utility costs, single lease or shared chores. So those are aspects that we feel very strongly will be able to be consistent with fair housing law. And what we're really thinking about is what's that number in addition to a single housekeeping unit, single household, that might push a property over the edge and create impacts to a neighborhood. So the one thing that we hadn't actually gotten much feedback on in previous meetings is, and I understand why, because people had other concerns, but was these numbers here, the 3 individuals, in addition to the single household, the 2 individuals, in addition to the duplex, the 2 individuals, in addition to the multi-dwelling unit. So if people have any thoughts on, given how this is constructed with a single housekeeping unit being something that isn't regulated, do you think that those numbers make sense? Interested in that feedback as well.
I'm interested in where and how this intersects with the fire code, because the smushiest part of the equation on this screen is what's the base number of the single household unit. But the fire code is pretty clear about the minimum square footage that's required for occupancy of a bedroom, 70 square feet for one person, another 50 square feet if you're going to put 2 people in. So where do these 2 pieces of regulation intersect?
So I recognize some of you from the last meeting that we had. Turn your mic on. All right, there. Yeah, yours is red. Green is okay. So green is on here, red is on there. So I recognize some of you from the last community meeting, and we talked a lot about building code, fire code, part of the building code, and this question about the square footages. So we did some research, and the building codes are updated every 3 years. There are a lot of references out there to things that are not in the code today. They're not in the California Housing Code, which is also a part of state law. We're looking through this. We see other jurisdictions that adopted parts of the old code into their city municipal codes that might have those standards. But those standards really go back to 1997 version of the building code. And according to current state law, cities are limited to following the current version of the International Building Code in California in terms of what the building code is. And the building code does not have occupancy standards in it that apply to bedrooms like that. There's requirements for a window of certain dimensions to exit. There's requirements for a closet. You do see in buildings like this, commercial, where there's an assembly space, there is an occupancy requirement tied to the number of egress ways you have to get out from the building and how much space there is around those, where they go out and so forth. But doesn't really, none of that really regulates single-family homes, in a meaningful way. We heard there's, something that might cap, 50 people based on plumbing, but that's really not helpful because that's such a big number. And so that's not really, and then just your initial question was, how does this relate to the building fire code, building code? All that is still certainly in effect. This is really an attempt to provide some additional regulations that we're trying to address the concern that, in the community about overcrowding in these single-family homes. So we're doing what we think we can within the provisions of federal and state law, but the standards you reference, has been looking pretty carefully. It's not there. It's confusing because if you go online and search, you'll find lots of references to it in various places, but it's not in the current building code.
Hi, I just had a question. Can you, in making these numbers per unit, is it possible to make a distinction between owner-occupied and non-owner-occupied properties?
Probably.
So our understanding is that it isn't possible. Also, I know there's some proposed legislation out there that might add something along that lines, but my understanding is under the current code, we don't have that ability to distinguish between owner-occupied and renter-occupied in terms of how we regulate the occupancy. And we can have business provisions, like, if something's being operated as a business, we can require like a business tax, business license. So, one of the things that we talked about doing before, currently the city does require that if someone owns 3 or more rental properties, that they have to obtain a business license, basically pay a fee to the city because they're operating a business. And so it came up in the last meeting, could we have some sort of inspection program tied to that? And that's a possibility.
Thank you. I watched the last meeting on the TV, so I was kind of caught up. But a lot of what they talked about last time was parking. And I live in 2 residences, Santa Clara and in West Hollywood. And in West Hollywood, we have permit parking, and it makes a small city from becoming overcrowded. And they are making so much money that the overflow from the permit parking allows them to do other things to the city that improves the city. Are you guys considering maybe putting permit parking around the university or around homes that are congested with parking?
Yeah, so we did get that feedback at the last meeting. Got some information about people feeling that the current neighborhood parking program made it difficult for neighborhoods that have a high prevalence of renters to participate in the program, and also that the cost of the program was quite expensive for individuals to retain on an annual basis. And so those pieces of information we are relaying to our Department of Public Works, to our city manager's office, as well as to the police department. The Public Works Department they administer that program, but the police department actually enforces it. So through this feedback, we're absolutely taking, we realize that there's like multiple things that kind of work in conjunction with each other. So we're definitely taking that information and talking to the relevant departments about how we can improve that process.
And just to add on to, ultimately, when we get in front of the city council or planning commission, we'll summarize all the input that we received from the community, and those things will come up. You sort of brought up another issue related to that, saying it could be a potential funding source for other improvements the neighborhood might want to see in the neighborhood, so we can add that into the input that we've received.
My question has to do with the minimum common habitable area. You guys are thinking about a range between 25% and 30%. You came up with that number by looking at permits that you've issued over how long of a period of time?
For 20 years.
And the average is 25 to 30%?
Actually, no, it's much higher than that.
Higher.
So we feel that 25%, if we say that's, like, let's not go with 25 to 30. If we say 25% is a percentage that we think the vast majority of properties would be able to meet.
How does that number differ for 2-story homes? Because typically second stories are all bedrooms. Do you see that number drop quite a bit on a second story versus a 1-story? And are you going to make a distinction?
We can do additional research to see if that creates a hardship for second-story homes. Our analysis looked at second-story and 1-story homes, and those were the numbers that we came up with. But we can look more, because actually that question about second-story homes, I don't know if it came up in a community meeting, but it's come up with me with another individual. So I would like to just provide that answer for individuals and whether or not there should be a different criteria for second-story homes. But the analysis we did was of all the single-family homes, second-story, 1-story, and today, as you know, most people are building up. So I don't know this for a fact, but we probably have a lot more analysis of second-story homes than first-story homes, given how people are constructing today.
I have two more questions. One, if an individual got a permit through you guys and it was, say, 31%, or I'm sorry, 24%, and you decide on 25%. So then, if I'm understanding this correctly, the owner of that property is supposed to rectify that 1% within 2 years?
Right. So, what we're currently proposing, yes. In a situation like that, that does bring up maybe there should be some consideration for a hardship for a very, meeting the intent, but maybe not the exact number if you're 24 versus 25. Maybe there's some steps that you can do. Those are things that's a situation that we really should consider and take
just some
take that
feedback
input.
on that. Nowadays, when you build new houses,
Mm-hmm.
they're full of what they call shear walls, load-bearing walls, et cetera, et cetera. When the architect and the engineer do this plan, some of these walls can't be moved. So that's just some feedback as far as trying to rectify something that the city already approved and the owner spent hundreds of thousands of dollars building.
No.
Check two, check. You may have just, whoops, where are you?
Yeah.
You may have just pressed it with your thumb on accident. Just make sure you don't press it.
Would you like me not to ask? Oh, may I ask a question? Okay, thank you. The other one I was wondering, as far as the, if you go to the slide where you have the +3, so you have the living unit and then you allow 3 more people. My understanding is you guys are allowing ADUs of up to 2 bedrooms if a lot is greater than 6,000 square feet. So would that limit the number of people allowed to live in that ADU? I own a single-family house, I build an ADU, that's 2 bedrooms. Would I only be allowed to rent it to 3 individuals?
So we would be looking at the individual structures as separate units.
Yeah, this is the slide I have a question on. So the single-family dwelling of 3 individuals in addition to the single housekeeping unit, I might be a little slow, but what does that mean in terms of max? Is it 3 or is it 5 or 6?
So the cloud, right, even though we have 4 individuals shown on that picture there, the cloud of what a single housekeeping unit is not a number we're defining as we've proposed it. We're not saying, it's really how individuals interact. So if we go, right, if it's 5 individuals sharing living expenses, a rent, a mortgage, food, utility costs, single lease, or shared chores. And where this really stems from is fair housing law acknowledges that we can't have rules that discriminate individuals based on the definition of family. So the definition of family isn't something that the federal government wants to say, that parents and children are family, that individuals who obviously have a relationship with each other in terms of, even if it's not a blood relationship, that relationship, is very integral to how they support themselves and how they keep their household. So that definition is really intended to meet fair housing law, which is why, in that same way, we wouldn't regulate the number of individuals in the household or housekeeping unit to be consistent with fair housing law. So what we're proposing is really trying to regulate the number of individuals outside of that, the bubble in the photo there, or in the image. Oh, excuse me,
just,
if we can have.
if I can add on a little bit. So you could have 4 people, all under separate leases, really not sharing and living facilities. Or you could have a family or a household group that could be 7 or 8 people, and they're renting out a room or 2 or 3 to someone else. So that's kind of what this represents.
So I'm still trying to understand, just
Yeah.
make sure I understand
Yeah.
this. So that definition that you showed a moment ago,
Yeah.
that could equally apply to 6 undergraduates, right? They share chores, maybe they share expenses, they're on a common, so, okay. So I understand that you're trying not to discriminate, but there's no reason why 6 undergraduates couldn't also fall under that definition, yeah.
Correct.
So when I lived back east, the city defined a boarding house as how you pay the rent. So let's say there's 4 people living in a house and the rent is $800 a person to the landlord, but one person leaves, then the rent becomes $2,400. So they're not committed to a $3,200 rent. So you could define a boarding house as how you pay the rent. And that would be another way to add this single housekeeping unit would be how the rent is paid. Because if you had 6 undergraduates living there, but they were each independently paying their rent to the landlord, and then one leaves, their landlord gets $800 less. Do you see what I'm saying? So it depends on if there's just one rent value that whoever's living there has to come up with $4,000 every month, regardless of how many people are there, versus everyone's paying their own rent independently.
So sort of like a single person on the lease has to pay all the rent.
Correct.
And they could collect it, they could turn
That's
around,
correct.
sublet, but they're the one person.
That's correct. Because that would prevent,
That's one thing.
I mean, that's how we define boarding houses in Cambridge. And so
And when was that said?
that was in 1985.
Yeah, so that just making a note that the laws here keep evolving.
I understand. But I believe that's still legal, is how you pay your rent. Whether the rent is variable depending on how many people live there or fixed, I think that's probably legal. And then regarding fire codes, I just want to make a comment. You could have a family, 2 parents and 6 kids living in a 2-bedroom house, or 8 kids or 10 kids if they had 10 kids. And that's still legal regardless of fire codes. It's just what they can afford to live, what they can afford to live in. So unfortunately, we can't define blood relatives. That's not how we're legally allowed to define a family. But that's one example of where fire codes don't really apply, because you could have 10 or 12 people there that happen to be one blood-related family. And then, so you're saying that if a landlord owns 3 homes, then they have to get a business license? So it's not
Correct.
2 or
3 properties.
So if somebody owns 1 house and they want to rent out to 3 people, they don't need a license?
That's the city's current code requirement.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry. I was just curious, like, how this all started, because when I think about who you're targeting, the first thing I think of is students, because when I think of a boarding house, I don't think of, like, maybe it's people in Silicon Valley that come from other places and they just all come together, but in Old Quad, it's generally just students, and basically that's, when they have parties and they're making noise and there's a lot of cars, it generally focuses more on students, but this doesn't change anything. So are you sort of I mean, in reality, you guys are like really being good about not pointing fingers, but what is this? Is it about them, or is it about just individuals altogether?
I think, the city's definitely received a lot of complaints over the years in the Old Quad neighborhood, which is adjacent to a university, right? But this issue has come up citywide, related, and not just related to students, but related to, hey, there are a lot of individuals living in my residence. This has come up a lot more recently with the popularization of short-term rental, Airbnb as well. But I think we're intentionally not trying to target anyone through the way that we're crafting these regulations, but address the overall issue of having too many individuals in structures that aren't really appropriate, or neighborhoods that aren't really appropriately designed for the amount of overcrowding that's existing.
Thank you.
If I might ask that you step back and look at maybe broadening the scope of what problem you're trying to address here, because you're defining a single house with multiple people, and the house was built and designed for an R1 single-family residence, but it is now subdivided or subleased to multiple individuals. Now, a single family might have 1 car, 2 cars at the most. When you put in 3 separate individuals, you're adding cars. You're adding to a parking problem. The house has maybe parking for 2 cars in the driveway, maybe 2 cars in the street. But when you put in 3, 4, 5 individuals, they all have cars, or at least most of them have cars. That creates a congestion in the streets, creates a parking problem, and it really creates a quality of life issue. Because a resident comes home, they don't have a place to park because the people in the high-density housing have packed in too many people with too many cars. I think we need to start looking at trying to not just define the number of people, but the number of cars that they have also, to address the parking in addition to the overcrowding in the house. Thank you.
Thanks.
If this all passes, how do you intend to enforce it? You mentioned something about code enforcement. How are the code enforcement officers going to know to go into a home? What if the person in the home does not allow them to come in? How are all these after the fact? I could see some individuals calling on homes just because they don't particularly like the people living there. So how does how do you enforce it? B, how's the city going to pay for all of this? It sounds like there's going to be a lot of money spent on this.
A couple things. So we've intentionally proposed these regulations in talking to our code enforcement team, so that what we're proposing are things that we could try and enforce when there are issues, which has become our current situation. The regulations are more difficult for that. So in relationship to the common habitable area, that's something that's very black and white. If there was an issue where the city, and often this would come up through code enforcement, where we get a complaint, there are a lot of individuals living in this house, we would contact that property owner, we would inform them of the regulations, we'd ask them to provide documentation. If that documentation was not sufficient, such as like floor plans, a lot of times also the city has, not in all cases, but in a lot of cases we do maybe have plans of projects and how they're developed, and if they've been altered, we can reference that as well. Or in relationship to the common habitable area, if the information they've provided us was not sufficient, we would ask to actually go into their property and take measurements, as we've described, and be able to provide, information if there was a violation to the property owner in that regard. Related to occupancy in a residence, so what we would be asking for is documentation about their living arrangements and their shared living arrangements. So how many individuals reside in the house? Do individuals have multiple leases? Do they share mortgage and rent, utility costs, and shared chores? That list is an or list, not an and list as proposed. So if they showed us documentation of that information, then we would be asking, okay, who isn't in a single housekeeping unit? And we would go to that number, is it 3 individuals in associated with a single family dwelling unit plus the single housekeeping unit? And we would then speak about violations, and we would have them take action or recourse to make sure that they were in compliance. Or we also have citations, and we penalize individuals from fines as well. And we have a variety of different means to actually put liens on the property if, this is through, after several communications and non-compliance. So if you'd like to.
I'd like to add on a few things too. Currently we spend a lot of time actually looking at remodels or additions too. So it's not just enforcement on existing properties. It could be very helpful to have this kind of standard so that when we, today, if someone submits a proposed remodel and we look at the floor plan, there may be instances where it clearly, kind of common sense wise, you can say, oh, they're trying to create a boarding house. But it's helpful to have an objective number that we could then point to and say, look, this is the city standard as well. So it's not just enforcement of existing, but a big part of what we're looking at least today, is new, and we can continue to do that. Code enforcement, one of the ideas out there too is that if we do have some kind of licensing requirement for people who own multiples of these, they would, we would add a fee that would then help fund the code enforcement on some sort of regular basis as well. Most of the time, people agree, to allow us into the residence. If we're out there, I think most property owners recognize that, maybe you can fight City Hall for a while, but it's better to work with us, and we try to get people to a place of compliance. But if absolutely necessary, there is a legal process the city can go through to obtain a warrant if there's just cause to actually require them to allow us into a residence, if it comes to that. But it rarely does.
I live about 2.5 blocks from the university, and I've been living there for 30 years. So I understand that makes me kind of like a rank newcomer to people who have been in that neighborhood for far longer than I. But my comment is, we have tenants on either side of us. The properties are used as rental units on both sides of us. And I really think it's important, as the city continues to move forward on this, that this not get into being student blaming. This is an issue throughout Silicon Valley. You don't have to spend 15 minutes on Facebook Marketplace before you see rental offerings for 1 of 2 bunk beds in a living room. And we really have to look at how we can provide the safest, healthiest environment for all of the residents of our city. And so I appreciate the meetings that the city has held so far, and a lot of the dialogue, a lot of the conversation, and I look forward to that continuing. But this isn't just a student issue. We do have a concentration around the university. We knew that when we moved in. But it's really citywide, profession-wide. It doesn't matter if you're an undergraduate, a graduate, or an engineer, or a teacher. This is a major issue for us to be addressing.
Thank you. I'm not sure if you understand what you're going to do to our city. Right now, on the single-family residences, if one comes up on the market, investors will come in, pick it up. You won't have a family anymore. You'll have a single-family dwelling of 8 or 9 students, or not students, people that work, whatever, and all of a sudden you're going to create a town full of rooming houses. That's exactly what you're going to do. You are going to ruin the R1 neighborhood. You're going to ruin the family neighborhood. Now, I know there's a lot of people here that probably have income property, that are probably landlords. I'm a landlord. I have property. But what they're going to do, every time you see a small house that comes on the market for, let's say, $1.1, $1.2 million, they will pick it up. They will create a single-family dwelling unit of 7, 8, 9 people on a lease. Anything you think you can do, the landlords can do it better. because landlords with the sophisticated leases that they can do actually are a lot smarter than the laws that you're going to try and do. And they will overrun you with tenants and tenements that you don't want. And to sit there and say, well, we can always charge permit parking. Hey, this is a residential neighborhood. Why should I pay for somebody to come in here and create a duplex, fourplex, or a sixplex on a single-family house? That's the problem I see. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And what we have heard, not just in this meeting, but in our previous meetings, is people really see the value in having a definition of boarding house and having that as be something that is explicitly not allowed. And I don't know if that's going to address your particular concern or.
I'm saying you're creating fourplexes on a single-family house. You're creating triplexes on a single-family house. People will come in and buy a little house. There's one on the market right now for $1.1 million. You come in, buy it, and all of a sudden you have yourself a triplex or a fourplex without doing anything except having.
I'll summarize. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, and you can correct me. But I think what the gentleman said was that essentially the proposed rules are going to allow triplexes, fourplexes, because individuals will be savvy enough to create leases that get around what we're proposing. And so by putting something out explicitly, we're creating an opportunity for people to kind of create their own loopholes to create these other situations. Did I get that right?
Those are the loopholes right up there. That is the loophole.
Right. Okay.
You're telling anybody to buy a house and you can have this. You can rent to 7 or 8 people on the lease and then a couple other people. There's your loophole.
And I would just add that today we don't have this regulation, so someone can potentially do it now. We're just trying to clarify what this would be a new regulation that's not existing today. So just add that on.
Hi, I'm kind of curious. Is there a sense that if these proposed ideas were to go through, and I'll talk about the 25%, not the 35% on habitable areas, is there a sense how many properties would currently be out of compliance?
So we don't have a listing of every property in the
Right.
city and what their floor plans are. So that's why we've gone through all the building permit records that we have. But we're talking about 1% that would be
that's what I was
non-compliant.
looking
Super,
for.
if we're getting to what we've analyzed, we wanted to really get to the heart of the problem, not create standards that are creating comfortable environments for people, just like really create bare
Exactly, that's why I
minimums.
was asking
Yeah.
that question. So if we're talking like, from your research so far, maybe 1%,
Right.
then it really is de
Right.
minimis. Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
I was going to say that we're pretty fortunate that we live in Santa Clara because we're currently now in Beverly Hills. They're trying to, if you live within a certain mile of a bus stop, they're allowing the houses to be torn down and built up into, apartment complexes, and just to meet the growing number of people that are wanting to live in that city. And this is Beverly Hills. And it's happened in my city, in West Hollywood as well, where the houses are brought down and they're built up to the sky, and that's just the norm because everyone wants to live in that city, and that's how the city's sort of growing. So whether you have people all wanting to smash into an R1, or if you tear it down and build it up, that's where things are sort of headed. So at some point, we might resolve this issue here, but 100 years from now, it's going to be completely different. You know what I'm saying?
I'll just add some information around that too. The reference to allowing development within a quarter mile of a bus stop, it's actually a proposed state Senate bill, SB 50, that was proposed this year. There was Weiner. Scott Weiner. Scott Weiner's proposal. And he had something similar last year that didn't go forward. This year, it's been put on hold. And so we'll come back next year. But if something like that, it's going through the state legislative process. So if it is enacted, it would probably affect all of us. So we'll see. We're monitoring that. Whole nother effort. But following that, and the city may take a position if it ultimately comes forward.
So I live in a single-family home in the old quad, and I have 2 party houses across the street from my house. And what I do is, as soon as they move in, I go over there and talk to them. I know the landlord, and I say, Duke, if I hear any problems, I'm going to call you, even if it's at 4 in the morning. So that's what we really want to do, is regulate behavior. And I see the big issues with behavior are noise, red Solo cups, and parking. And so can you describe what it takes for a neighborhood to get a permit parking program in?
Yeah, so our current parking permit program requires, so our Department of Public Works will come out. They will hold, information meetings, as well as make sure that property owners have to, first of all, there's like a survey that is initially sent to the property owners within whatever area that they are considering, as well as property owners outside the immediate area, because as you can imagine, if you create a parking permit area in a couple blocks, people are going to just park 2 blocks over. So it's beyond just the immediate parking area. In that survey, they need property owners to indicate that they want to participate. And wanting to participate means that somebody affirmatively says they want to participate. So if the survey is not responded to, which is often the case, that's considered saying that they're not interested in participating. We've gotten feedback from people in the community that they think that's a bit unfair. If people aren't going to respond to your survey, you shouldn't count their vote. So that's some piece of feedback that we're going to relay to our Department of Public Works too on the policy. So if over 50%, a majority has to be over a majority of the property owners are interested in participating, then a neighborhood parking program can be established. That is a long process. Just the whole process of surveying residents, getting communications, actually administering the permits, and then the police department actually enforces that. So I believe that's, it's based on complaints to essentially, I think it's 411 is the number, 311, the non-emergency line, right? So that the police can issue citations or towing or whatnot. And then individuals in those neighborhoods do have to pay a fee annually. I don't know the number off the top of my head of what they have to pay. $20 to $50 annually, which individuals have also told us they think that's, very expensive and unfair for people who are part of a parking issue to have to pay to be part of a parking permitting process. So we've received feedback, as I mentioned previously, that individuals feel it creates a situation where when there's a prevalence of rentals in an area, that often they've observed that those property owners won't participate in a parking program or be interested in participating. So it creates some obstacles for neighborhoods where there's a prevalence of rental properties. So we've gotten that feedback. We're going to share that for, our city management team and our public works on really areas for improving and hearing the feedback and taking that feedback to improve the program as well.
When it comes to parking, have you, the city, ever considered talking to the university and asking the university to offer free parking for their students? They just built a brand new, well, maybe it's 5 years old now, parking structure. And I know I went to Santa Clara University, and the parking permits were not cheap. So have you guys considered that? Or maybe I should make that a suggestion to try to somewhat alleviate the parking problems near the university. If the school offered free parking to all students, that may make a good dent into that issue.
We'll take that back as feedback. I know the university has had some interaction with the neighborhood, talking about what they charge for parking. And this is a place where you potentially have competing goals. they're trying to encourage their students, faculty, staff to not necessarily drive to the university, but to come by transit or other means. And so their parking fees are actually low compared to Stanford or other universities around. So there's some talk about should they raise that. There's some folks advocating that they should raise that to try to discourage driving, but they recognize that it can cause spillover parking to the neighborhood. So that's an ongoing discussion, but it's good feedback too.
Hi. In the parking permit situation, how are permits dispensed? Is it based on size of home or number of occupants or the permits, you know?
I believe it's 2 per residence, regardless of the size of the property.
And those are for, obviously you can park in your house, in your garage, on your,
Right.
Those are for on-street
Street.
spaces.
Hi, one thing I didn't see in the proposal, and I think we've talked about it before, is the city to require registration of all rental properties and inspection of rental properties. I mean, part of the issue is regulating the business aspects of this and not just the housing aspects of it. So I would definitely encourage that, and I would rather see just the square footage, the common area square footage implemented, and I do see that the number of residents in an occupants in a residence is a double-edged sword. I think it opens the door, as this gentleman said, to a roadmap for how to maximize the residents, number of occupants in a residence.
Out of curiosity, have you conferred with other cities, other municipalities that are currently experiencing the same overcrowding? I've been to meetings in Mountain View, and that was more of a complaint from property owners, residents, about the Airbnbs and the number of people that were now next door to them. And it is, I think, widespread throughout the valley. But are you working with other cities to see what they've implemented to try and reduce this crowding problem and the congestion of the streets?
Yeah, we've done a lot of research, and we have been talking to city staff and researching ordinances throughout the state. Santa Cruz, San Jose, those both have universities and have had similar issues. Santa Barbara, other cities just that are near our neighboring cities, we always go to and make sure we understand what's going on. Sunnyvale, Mountain View. So these regulations are somewhat consistent with what actually many of our neighboring cities, their approaches as well, partially because we all have to deal with federal fair housing law. And so this is an approach that other neighboring cities have taken as well.
Okay, I can understand in the maybe vacation spots or in Santa Barbara or some of the coastal towns, and in the valley here, though, there's an employment problem, and people are renting out rooms. I know I see it in Sunnyvale, and I see it in Santa Clara and in Mountain View. I've been to the meetings, but I'm hoping you're working with them in conjunction with them to come up with some kind of a standard so that we can minimize this packing in of people into what used to be an R1 house. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Otherwise, I just want to go back and tell you all what next steps are. Any other questions? So, as I mentioned, we're taking the input we've received. It's the same presentation that was given at these last 3 meetings, and we'll be taking that. There's some research we certainly need to do, looking at different opportunities, a lot of different topics that were brought up. We're going to post our minutes, by the way. You can always obviously see this video again, but we'll be taking the comments we've received and posting the minutes on our website. We are also going to be sending out those online surveys in the next couple of weeks, so check your emails for that, whatever email address you left with us. You can also check our website, which is where we're going to post a link to the survey, and that will allow you to comment on other things, not just this, but if you have an opinion on short-term rentals, that'll be an opportunity to provide comment. If you guys want to talk about your unique situation, your property, you know, hey, you're concerned about this common habitable area, is your property gonna have problems with it? Happy to talk about any of this stuff and talk about your unique circumstances. We do intend to bring a study session to Planning Commission and City Council in fall of 2019. Right now, the tentative date around that is in October 2019. And if you've given us your email address, we will make sure to notify you. And the entire zoning code update will be considered by our Planning Commission and City Council, as we're hoping, towards the end of this year, early next year, because we really want, you know, and I know that everyone may have different opinions on our approach, but our intention is really try to make our current situation better. So really are excited about taking the feedback that you have, trying to make some tweaks, seeing what other ways we can better address the concerns that we've heard the last few meetings. So thank you all.
We have one more question.
Actually, it's more of a comment. I was at the first meeting, and I really want to thank the approach you've used, because from that first meeting to this meeting, I've heard some very interesting rumors about what's happening in Santa Clara. And I think that holding these kinds of meetings and taking the input from the community before anything goes to City Council is just so important. But one other small question, I know this is being live streamed. For those maybe that, well, can you pull up the April 29th and May 16th presentations as well?
Sure.
So
Yeah.
in other words, somebody could actually
The
look at
April
what's discussed
29th
on all
meeting
of
was
them?
not live streamed.
Okay.
However, the May 16th and tonight's meeting was. The presentations are virtually the same, and I can
I know
make sure
they are,
that
yeah.
the April 29th meeting, the presentations for all three meetings can be posted or made available so people can see if there were any, you know, periods missing, commas, whatnot. But it's really the same presentation. That's
No,
going
and I understood that, and I'm very appreciative of that, but I think sometimes one doesn't even realize the questions they had until after.
Sure.
And so by going back and looking at what happened
Right.
on May 16th,
Sure.
might have that question answered for them. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and we just want people to also be aware, you know, because sometimes if you've seen multiple dates for a meeting, you think that the conversation has evolved. We're just getting input right now. So we've gotten all your feedback. We're not evolving yet. We're taking it back, and we're going to provide some more research and bring this back to you all through a study session and then staying engaged with you as you see fit as well. Thank you. This concludes our meeting tonight.
Off.
But this one needs on.
This is on. Red is on.